Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are stepping into territory that is, well, it's highly debated, it's fiercely contested, and it is undeniably fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. We're going in at the deep end today.
Exactly. And I want to welcome you, the listener, right out of the gate. Specifically, if you are someone deeply engaged in the men's rights movement,
Right.
or if you consider yourself a part of the manosphere, or if you're actively seeking out red-pilled content, today's deep dive is custom tailored exactly for you.
Absolutely.
We are going to explore the history and the current state of our modern institutions from a very specific, highly structured perspective.
It's a perspective that argues these very institutions were systematically captured.
Yes, captured and dismantled long before most people even realized a shift was happening. But real quick, before we get into the weeds, a quick reminder to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these deep dives.
It is genuinely great to be here. The source material we are unpacking today is incredibly dense. I mean, it spans multiple disciplines and it pulls absolutely zero punches.
It really doesn't. We are doing an extensive, fine-toothed comb review of the 2025 ebook. It's called Phases of Life: Archetypal, Jungian, Ericksonian, Piagetian, Kohlbergian, and Freudian by Conrad Riker.
It's a mouthful of a title, but it tells you exactly what you're getting into.
It does, so let's unpack this for you. This book is an ultra-long, incisive, and fascinating manifesto. It builds this massive foundation, pulling from history, evolutionary biology, and cognitive psychology.
And the core pitch to you, the listener, is essentially this. If you want to understand exactly how traditional male archetypes were dismantled over the last few decades, this is it.
Right, and perhaps more importantly, how to reclaim them. This book is positioned as essential reading, so right off the bat, I highly encourage you to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book, and to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack.
But before we start peeling back the layers of Riker's arguments, it is absolutely crucial that we lay out the mission and the parameters for this deep dive.
Definitely, we need to set the ground rules.
Right, because our goal today is to thoroughly unpack Riker's central thesis regarding the perceived capture of Western institutions by feminist and Marxist ideologies, and I want to explicitly state right up front that this show operates with strict, ironclad impartiality.
100%.
We are not taking political sides here. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, the political left, or the political right. Our job is strictly and impartially to report on the factual content provided in this text.
We're acting as your expert guides.
Exactly. To help you fully grasp Riker's controversial and, frankly, highly complex framework.
Yeah, we're looking at a text that is making serious waves in certain circles. Whether you agree with its foundational premise or find it completely flawed, Riker's book attempts to build a massive, structured argument.
And our goal today is to map that argument out for you so you can see the architecture of what he's saying.
So where do we start?
Well, to give you a roadmap of our sources today, we are going to be covering the book's 20 chapters, but we've organized the author's arguments thematically to make it digestible.
Because jumping back and forth chronologically in a book this dense is tough.
Right. So we will be exploring the historical collapse of the family unit, the institutional approach to boyhood, the intense debate over logic versus emotion in academia, the cold realities of evolutionary biology in the modern mating market, the restructuring of hierarchy in labor, and finally, Riker's ultimate call to reclaim tangible physical skills and parallel brotherhoods.
So let's just jump right into that first theme. If you spend any time in this space, you are likely already deeply familiar with the concept of the family courts being a hostile environment for men.
Yeah, it's a foundational grievance in the manosphere.
But what makes Riker's approach in chapters 1 and 14 different is how he traces this back to a very specific structural genesis.
He points directly to the 1975 California Family Law Act.
Exactly, the act that formalized and normalized no-fault divorce. Riker views this as ground zero for the collapse of the modern family structure.
And according to him, virtually overnight, the legal leverage and the fundamental social contract that fathers held was completely erased.
How so? Like, break down the mechanism of that historical shift for us.
Well, it's critical to understand Riker's broader point here. He argues that before no-fault divorce, marriage was treated as a binding contract. If you wanted to dissolve that contract, there had to be actionable grounds.
Like abandonment or infidelity.
Right. Severe instability. It required proof of a breach of contract. But by removing fault entirely from the equation, Riker contends that the state fundamentally altered its relationship with the family.
So it became less about protecting the family and more about state intervention.
That's his argument. He says the state didn't step in to protect children, it stepped in to effectively remove the authority of fathers.
Wow.
He points out that the old tender years doctrine,
The assumption that young kids just naturally belong with their moms?
exactly that 19th century legal principle, it was formally scrapped from the books during the gender equality movements. But Riker argues it didn't actually disappear, it just went underground. It evolved into an unspoken, impenetrable institutional bias.
And the statistics he brings up to support the existence of this bias are genuinely staggering. He cites that by the year 2020, 80% of U.S. child custody cases resulted in primary maternal custody.
80%.
80%. And he specifically preempts the common counterargument here. He makes a point to say, look, you cannot blame this massive disparity simply on women being the primary caregivers due to historical employment differences.
Right, because the modern data doesn't support that anymore.
Exactly. He pulls U.S. Census data showing nearly equal employment rates between men and women in the modern era. Fathers are just as present in the workforce. They are just as capable of providing a home environment. But the family court matrix still overwhelmingly defaults to the mother.
This is where we really need to look at the financial architecture underlying the system, because Riker is exploring how the state has effectively replaced the father with a massive self-sustaining bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy always finds a way to feed itself.
Always. And he points out a glaring systemic issue that most people are completely unaware of. In cases involving state welfare, the government actually keeps 100% of the child support payments in 12 different states.
Wait, let me make sure I'm tracking Riker's logic here. They keep the money.
Yes. The logic of the state is that it is recouping the cost of the welfare provided to the mother.
So is he saying that the state is financially incentivized to keep families broken apart?
Precisely, because in those specific situations, there is zero financial incentive for the mother to facilitate a relationship or allow visitation with the father, because she isn't seeing a dime of that child support money anyway.
It goes straight into the state's coffers.
Exactly. The state, therefore, becomes the primary financial beneficiary of the broken home. Riker's controversial conclusion is that the bureaucratic state doesn't actually want fathers in the home at all. It wants dependence.
Because breaking the family expands the reach, the funding, and the necessity of the bureaucracy itself.
That's the argument.
That is a deeply cynical view of the system. But he backs it up by directly attacking the cultural myth of the deadbeat dad.
Right, the guy who just walks out and doesn't care.
Which Riker says is largely a fabrication. He cites Pew Research showing that 70% of non-custodial fathers actively want to be involved in their children's lives. They want shared custody.
That the system blocks them.
Yeah. 60% of them report being actively obstructed either by their ex-partners, by exorbitant lawyer fees they can't afford, or by hostile judges. His takeaway is that we don't have a crisis of deadbeat dads. We have a crisis of a deadbeat system.
And to bring this out of the abstract data, he shares this devastating anecdote about a man named Brad Otto.
Oh, the Ohio case. That one is brutal.
It really is. In 2016, Brad was standing in an Ohio courtroom. By all metrics, he was an ideal candidate for shared custody. He had no criminal history. He held a stable, well-paying job. He brought in documentation, proving he regularly picked up his kids from school and coached their teams.
He was just a normal, involved dad.
Right. And he was simply fighting for equal 50-50 shared custody.
And what happened?
The judge looked at his file, denied his request, and according to the transcript, simply said, "Kids need their moms."
Unbelievable. Just a flat denial based on a feeling.
Just like that. His fundamental legal and biological rights as a parent were brushed aside based on an emotional heuristic.
Which brings us to the psychological frameworks mentioned in the book's title, right?
Yeah.
How Riker uses them to analyze the impact of this systemic fatherlessness.
Yes. He leans heavily on the developmental psychology of Sigmund Freud and Erik Erikson here.
Break that down for us. What's the connection?
Well, Freud posited that the father figure is essential for the development of the superego. That's the part of the psyche that understands rules, boundaries, and societal expectations.
The structural part of the mind.
Exactly. And Erikson talked about the critical stages of identity formation. When you remove the father, Riker argues, you aren't just removing a second income, you're removing the primary psychological boundary setter.
And the data backs up the fallout from that, doesn't it?
It does. He pulls CDC data from 2018 that highlights the fallout. Fatherless boys are 5 times more likely to suffer from clinical depression and 4 times more likely to attempt suicide.
God, those numbers are bleak.
Riker argues that you don't protect a child by severing them from their father under the guise of maternal preference. You traumatize them at a foundational level.
To illustrate that psychological void, he tells the story of a 17-year-old kid named Jason from Detroit. Jason's dad left the picture when he was 2 years old. His mom was working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, so she was effectively a ghost in his daily life as well.
He was raising himself.
Basically, Jason told Reichert in an interview, "I didn't know what a man was supposed to be. I just knew what I saw on TV. Either you're a thug or you're a clown."
That is a chilling quote.
It really is. So at 14 years old, Jason joined a local gang. And Riker makes the crucial point here. Jason didn't join the gang for the drug money or the territory.
He joined for the identity.
Exactly. He was desperately searching for a structured hierarchy of men to tell him who he was. He was looking for a father archetype.
And Riker contrasts Jason's trajectory perfectly with the story of J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings.
The Tolkien parallel is absolutely fascinating from a Jungian perspective.
It really is. Set the stage for that one.
So, Tolkien was completely orphaned at the age of 12 when his mother died. He could have easily spiraled into absolute despair. But he and his brother were taken in by Father Francis Morgan.
Who was a strict, highly disciplined Catholic priest.
Yes, who became their legal guardian. And Father Morgan didn't offer soft maternal coddling. He enforced rigid discipline, structured schedules, and intense academic rigor.
He provided the boundary setting Freud talked about.
Right. Riker uses this historical example to prove what he sees as the absolute necessity of male authority in a boy's development. It doesn't even have to be biological fatherhood. It's the function of fatherhood, the imposition of order and expectation that builds functional men.
And that specific function, the imposition of order, boundaries, and traditional masculine expectations, Riker insists, is currently viewed as a direct threat by what he terms a gynocentric state incentive.
Explain that term, gynocentric.
Well, he argues that modern feminism didn't ultimately liberate women from an oppressive patriarchy, as the mainstream narrative suggests. Instead, he claims it essentially replaced the patriarchy with a matriarchy that is heavily backed and enforced by state power and bureaucratic force.
And all while labeling this massive shift as progress.
Right. By pathologizing the natural male presence and simultaneously romanticizing and subsidizing female victimhood, the state effectively neuters the archetype of the father,
leaving boys like Jason completely lost.
The tragic end result, according to Riker, is that young boys are left entirely without a map for how to navigate their own masculinity.
So if the state is systematically removing the father from the home, as Riker argues, it begs the question, how does the system then handle the young boys left behind?
And that leads us straight into Riker's highly controversial take on the institutional approach to boyhood.
This is chapters 2, 8, 12, and 17. This is where the book gets really visceral.
It does. He starts by establishing a historical baseline, contrasting the ancient Spartan agoge with modern American public education.
For those who aren't history buffs, tell them about the agoge.
In ancient Sparta, at the age of 7, boys were removed from their mothers and thrown into a brutal state-run boot camp called the agoge.
7 years old.
Yes. They were given exactly 1 cloak to wear for the entire year. They slept on rough reed mats they had to pull from the river Eurotas themselves, and they were intentionally underfed so they would have to learn how to steal food to survive.
And if they were caught?
If they were caught, they were beaten not for stealing, but for being sloppy enough to get caught.
Wow.
It was a crucible designed from the ground up to weaponize them, to forge them into incredibly resilient warriors.
Now, obviously, Riker isn't advocating that we return to starving 7-year-olds and forcing them to sleep on river reeds.
No, not at all. What he is doing is establishing a spectrum of how human civilizations have historically treated male development.
Historically, societies utilized a crucible of some kind. They recognized that male energy required friction to become useful.
Contrast that historical baseline with the modern classroom environment. Riker points out a staggering statistic. Modern boys diagnosed with ADHD are 3 times more likely to be prescribed heavy stimulants like Adderall and Ritalin than girls.
3 times more likely.
Furthermore, boys currently make up an astonishing 72% of all special education referrals.
Which proves Riker's core argument here. Natural male energy, the biological drive for aggression, hyperactivity, physical play, and dominance, is actively and systematically pathologized in modern classrooms.
Classrooms, which he notes, are environments where 77% of the teaching workforce is female.
Right. He argues that the very architecture of the modern classroom is designed by women to optimize for the behavioral tendencies of girls.
It heavily rewards compliance, sitting perfectly still for 8 hours a day and demonstrating emotional empathy.
Conversely, it heavily punishes physical energy, stoicism, and competitive dominance. He uses the example of Chris Kyle, the famous Navy SEAL sniper, to illustrate this.
The American sniper.
Yeah. Chris Kyle grew up on a rural Texas ranch. His childhood was entirely physical, shooting guns, skinning animals, riding horses, being relentlessly restless. Riker notes that in that specific environment, no one pathologized Chris Kyle's high-octane energy. It was viewed as a tool.
It was directed, honed, and utilized, not chemically destroyed.
Exactly. Now compare that historical rural upbringing to a story Riker shares of a modern 15-year-old boy who was suspended from his high school simply for playing a game of tag in the courtyard. Tag. The school suspended him because they had instituted a strict zero-tolerance policy regarding any physical contact whatsoever.
This systemic suppression of physical energy is what Riker refers to as the domestication gradient.
The domestication gradient. That is a powerful phrase.
It is, and he brings in endocrine data to show that this isn't just a behavioral shift, it is a profound biological one.
The testosterone drop.
Yes. He cites a widely circulated longitudinal study showing a 1.3% per year drop in average young men's testosterone levels since 1987.
If you compound that over decades, it is a massive population-level biological shift.
Riker attributes this catastrophic drop not just to environmental factors like microplastics or poor diet, though he acknowledges those play a role, but fundamentally to a societal structure that actively suppresses the daily need for testosterone.
Because when young boys are chemically neutered with amphetamine-based stimulants to force their compliance in a quiet classroom, you are effectively turning off the biological engine that drives innovation, risk-taking, and protection.
He also talks at length about the absolute loss of initiation rites in Western culture.
Which is huge. If you look at indigenous cultures, there is always a clear demarcation line between being a boy and being a man.
Right. He brings up the Maasai people in Kenya, where historically, a boy could only officially enter the warrior class after tracking and hunting a lion.
Or the Kungsan people of the Kalahari Desert, where 12-year-old boys are sent out into the harsh wilderness alone to face hunger, exposure, and predators.
And he compares those ancient visceral rites of passage to modern college emotional safety briefings.
Oh man, the contrast is absurd.
It is. In these briefings, young, able-bodied men are sat down in a circle and told how to report microaggressions to an administrator.
Riker says that without a true trial, without a definitive moment where a boy is pushed to his absolute physical and psychological limit, and then officially welcomed into the fraternity of manhood by older, respected men, the developmental process stalls.
The result is an entire generation suffering from Peter Pan syndrome.
Millions of men in their 30s living in their parents' basements, sinking thousands of hours into video games, fundamentally because they were never initiated into reality.
And from Riker's perspective, the broader culture doesn't just tolerate this Peter Pan syndrome, it actively rewards and encourages it.
The culture relabels things.
Exactly. The modern cultural narrative frequently relabels sensitivity as strength. It relabels passivity and risk aversion as wisdom. It categorizes avoiding difficult challenges as self-care.
But nature, as Riker warns, is entirely indifferent to your feelings. The universe, historically and biologically, responds only to action, leverage, and risk.
When a society successfully suppresses the Jungian warrior archetype in its young men, you do not achieve a peaceful utopia. You achieve widespread passivity, depression, and occasionally you get erratic, directionless explosions of violence.
Precisely because that natural aggression was never properly channeled or disciplined by older men. So we've seen how Riker builds his case, that the physical reality of boyhood is suppressed by the institutions. But he doesn't stop there. He then moves on to argue that the male intellect is undergoing the exact same suppression.
Moving into chapters 3, 15, and 19.
Right. We look at the battleground of logic, censorship, and the institutional capture of academia. Riker essentially argues that our institutions of higher learning, which were built to be the pinnacle of rational thought, have completely abandoned logic in favor of an overriding emotionalism.
To build this argument, Riker roots his definitions in classical philosophy. He specifically points to Aristotle's formal syllogism and the Stoic philosophy of Emperor Marcus Aurelius as foundational masculine cognitive frameworks.
To use Piaget's terms from cognitive development, Riker is talking about the mastery of the formal operational stage.
Which is the ability to detach from personal feeling and manipulate abstract logical variables objectively.
Riker reminds the reader that Marcus Aurelius ruled the entirety of the Roman Empire. When faced with a barbarian invasion on the frontier, Aurelius didn't ask his generals how the invasion made them feel.
And he didn't center his own lived experience.
Exactly. He analyzed the threat, calculated his logistical resources, and responded with cold, detached, linear logic.
Riker asserts that the entirety of Western civilization, its legal systems, and its scientific method were built on this kind of detached, objective reasoning. But today, he argues, universities have completely inverted this cognitive hierarchy.
The numbers he provides to demonstrate this inversion are wild. He notes that back in 1965, 86% of all university philosophy departments in the United States required an undergraduate course in strict formal logic to graduate.
86%.
By the year 2023, that requirement had plummeted to just 29%.
Meanwhile, over that exact same time period, the funding and presence of gender studies and grievance-based academic programs exploded by over 400%.
His conclusion is that the Academy has deliberately traded deduction for declaration and swapped the rigorous standard of Aristotelian proof for the subjective, unassailable standard of lived experience.
What is particularly fascinating about this section is Riker's concept of what he calls the campus censorship pipeline.
Oh, this is brilliant. Break down the pipeline.
He maps out exactly how this anti-logic framework operationalizes itself on a modern campus. It always starts, he says, with the introduction of a trigger warning.
Which seems harmless on the surface.
Right, it seems harmless, but Riker argues it normalizes the radical idea that mere information can be equated to physical harm.
And once you accept that information is harmful, the logical next step is the creation of safe spaces.
Which physically and intellectually insulates students from ever encountering opposing ideas.
And once students are accustomed to being insulated, that inevitably leads to the final stage, deplatforming.
This is where the institution itself actively silences, fires, or removes the dissenting voice entirely in order to protect the emotional safety of the student body.
Riker argues that empathy is a virtue. But empathy, when it is completely divorced from reason and logic, becomes a weapon used to silence all debate.
He gives some highly specific, deeply documented real-world examples from the text to prove this pipeline exists.
Like the Yale Halloween costume scandal.
Exactly. From 2015, involving professors Nicholas and Nicole Christakis.
For context for you listening, the administration sent out an email policing what Halloween costumes students should wear to avoid cultural insensitivity. Nicole Christakis, who was an early childhood educator, sent an email back suggesting that college students are adults and perhaps they should be allowed to negotiate their own offensive behavior without administrative oversight.
The campus backlash was explosive.
Hundreds of students surrounded Nicholas Christakis in the courtyard, screaming obscenities at him, weeping openly, and demanding that he apologize and resign.
And eventually, the university caved to the pressure, and they did step down from their residential roles.
Riker views this event not as a silly debate over Halloween costumes, but as a defining cultural milestone. He calls it a ritual humiliation of rational authority by an emotional insurgency.
In that courtyard, facts and logic didn't matter at all. Female-coded emotional distress was established as the supreme moral currency.
And he traces the escalation of that behavior directly to the violent assault on Charles Murray at Middlebury College in 2017.
Murray, a controversial political scientist, was invited to speak, but the student mob didn't attend the lecture to counter his research with a better research or sharper logic.
No, they used air horns, they chanted, and they eventually physically mobbed him and his faculty interviewer, Allison Stanger.
Giving her concussion.
They used pure noise and violence to prevent the logical exchange of ideas. And Riker makes a critical leap here. He links this specific brand of campus behavior directly to the algorithms that currently run modern tech platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok.
Let me stop you there because this is a fascinating jump.
Right.
Is he saying that the algorithms themselves are inherently anti-logic? Or is he arguing that they're just exploiting a biological vulnerability that these universities have already primed the students for?
It's the latter, but combined with corporate incentive. Riker argues that these algorithms are engineered to prioritize emotional reactivity, specifically outrage, fear, and anger.
Because those emotions drive the most engagement and keep eyes on the screen.
Objective truth and nuanced logical debate are boring to an algorithm. He He brings up the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story by major tech platforms weeks before the 2020 election.
The platforms didn't actually dispute the technical facts or the authenticity of the hard drive.
They blocked the URL from being shared because it violated a preferred narrative. They optimized the flow of information for what one leaked Google engineer presentation famously called inclusive outcomes rather than objective reality.
In this environment of enforced emotional consensus, Riker argues that the concept of the red pill isn't about hate or misogyny, despite how the media frames it.
He redefines the red pill as the rigorous pursuit of clarity, the commitment to accepting hard, logical truths, no matter how uncomfortable, over-comforting, emotionally managed illusions.
And accepting hard biological truth is exactly where he goes next.
Because if the institutions are captured by emotional frameworks that obscure reality, nowhere is that more obvious, according to Riker, than in the realm of evolutionary biology.
Moving into chapters 4, 6, and 13, we explore the realities of biology, the mating market, and the legal matrix.
Riker states his premise bluntly. Biological sex is not a fluid spectrum, and it is not a social construct.
It is a fixed, binary mammalian reality determined immutably by the presence or absence of the SRY gene on the Y chromosome.
Riker gets very specific about the real-world physical consequences of a society pretending that this biological reality doesn't exist.
He points to the world of athletics, bringing up Caster Semenya, the runner with XY chromosomes and internal tests, who completely and predictably dominated women's track events for years.
He also mentions the intense controversy surrounding Leah Thomas.
The biological male who transitioned and went on to win an NCAA Division I women's swimming championship, shattering long-standing records held by biological women.
But he takes it a step further into much darker territory by examining the terrifying reality of women's prisons in the United Kingdom.
He cites an official government inspectorate report detailing 11 horrific sexual assaults that occurred within women's penal facilities, committed by inmates who identified as female but were biologically male and fully intact.
Riker's argument is stark. When academic ideology is allowed to trump biological anatomy, it is almost always women who end up suffering the severe physical consequences.
And he details how the institutions aggressively punish anyone who points out this obvious reality. He spends time discussing the Maya Forsater Tribunal in the UK.
Forsater was a researcher who lost her job at an international think tank simply for tweeting that biological sex is real and immutable.
She was dragged through a grueling legal process for stating a basic biological fact.
Riker sees cases like hers as the ultimate proof that our elite institutions have been entirely captured by an ideology that demands strict compliance. It demands that you reject objective biological reality in favor of subjective emotional identity.
Having established that the institutions deny biological reality, Riker then pivots straight into how this denial distorts the mating market.
Which he argues has been completely weaponized by technology.
He describes modern dating apps like Tinder and Bumble not as platforms for human connection, but as hyper-optimized slot machines designed specifically to exploit male psychology and desperation.
He brings up the infamous 80-20 rule.
Right. If you were listening to this and you're in the manosphere, you know the 80-20 rule inside and out.
It's the data showing that women on dating apps find 80% of men unattractive, and they compete exclusively for the top 20% of men.
But what makes Riker's breakdown of this so interesting is how he layers high-level evolutionary psychology over that brutal algorithm.
Exactly. This is where Riker applies the foundational research of Dr. David Buss, a pioneer in evolutionary psychology.
For those who aren't familiar with Buss's work, he conducted massive cross-cultural studies across dozens of different societies to determine what humans actually look for in mates.
His research conclusively showed that over millions of years of harsh evolutionary history, human female mating strategies were hardwired by survival needs.
Women evolved to select mates based on cues of dominance, physical status, and the ability to provision resources.
Riker argues that modern dating apps don't actually reward genuine status or the actual ability to provide.
They reward the visual, superficial performance of dominance and, crucially, emotional unavailability.
He analyzes this to explain why the stereotypical nice guy fails so consistently and so miserably in the modern dating market.
In the harsh mathematics of the mating market, high emotional and financial investment combined with low dominance equals instant rejection.
Women, he argues, are biologically repelled by male desperation, especially when that desperation is disguised as generosity or agreeableness.
To hammer this point home, He shares a fascinating case study of a real guy he calls Brad.
Oh, the Brad profile experiment.
Yeah, Brad was objectively a catch by traditional standards. He made 180K a year, he owned a home, he cooked, he volunteered at an animal shelter, and his dating profile featured photos of him smiling warmly and looking approachable.
And he got absolutely zero matches. Zero.
So, as an experiment, Brad completely changed his profile. He took down the volunteering photos. He put up a poorly lit photo of him in a leather jacket, holding a drink, smirking in a dive bar, looking like a stereotypical bad boy.
He deleted his thoughtful bio and left it completely blank.
His match rate tripled overnight.
Why? Because the leather jacket, the smirk, and the lack of a bio didn't signal that he was a bad person. They signaled scarcity, boundary control, and dominance.
Riker tells his readers that men need to fundamentally change their approach. They need to stop acting like desperate discount coupons hoping to be redeemed and start acting like luxury Apple products.
Artificially creating scarcity to drive up their perceived value.
But Riker goes much further than just dating app strategy. He examines what happens when men actually do succeed in the mating market and attempt to move toward traditional family formation.
He points out a stunning demographic collapse. Marriage rates for young men have plummeted from 55% in 1990 to just 32% today.
And he attributes this massive drop not to a sudden lack of desire for love or companionship, but to a rational risk assessment.
The modern manosphere, Riker points out, views modern marriage not as a romantic union, but as a highly dangerous, legally asymmetrical contract.
Under the current legal matrix we discussed earlier, men assume virtually all of the financial and legal risk of the partnership.
While the state enables and even incentivizes unilateral exit for women without any meaningful consequence.
He ties this legal peril directly to the weaponization of Title IX on college campuses and the broader cultural impact of the Me Too movement.
Which he argues completely dismantled male due process. He cites deeply concerning data from the National Coalition for Men showing that on university campuses, 93% of sexual assault claims handled by campus tribunals lack any physical evidence whatsoever.
Yet, despite the lack of evidence, those same tribunals result in a 90% expulsion rate for the accused men.
The historical legal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt has been replaced by the preponderance of evidence.
Which on a campus often just means whoever is more emotionally convincing.
The presumption of innocence, Riker says, which is the bedrock of Western law, has been entirely replaced by the institutional presumption of male guilt.
Given this incredibly hostile environment where dating apps are rigged, marriage is a financial trap, and due process is suspended, Riker's advice to men is highly controversial, yet completely consistent with his overarching framework.
He advises men to radically react by withdrawing their sexual, emotional, and financial investment from the system entirely.
By selectively walking away from a game that is mathematically rigged against them, men artificially create a massive societal scarcity of male attention and provision.
By reclaiming their leverage in the mating market, he argues, they will eventually force society to renegotiate the terms of engagement on more equitable, traditional grounds.
This brings us to a massive inflection point in the book's logic.
Right. If men are systematically withdrawing their energy from family formation and the dating market, as Riker claims, it begs the obvious question, where is all that male energy going?
Or rather, where is it being withdrawn from next?
And that leads us straight into chapters 5, 7, 9, and 18, where Riker turns his sights on the modern workplace, the destruction of hierarchy, and the feminization of labor and war.
Riker comes out swinging in aggressive defense of traditional hierarchies. He completely rejects the modern Marxist notion that hierarchies are merely arbitrary structures of oppression designed to keep people down.
He argues that functional hierarchies are natural structures of competence and profound responsibility.
To validate this, he looks outside of human sociology and turns to primatology. He cites the extensive work of Franz de Waal, who studied chimpanzee troops for decades.
De Waal's research showed that in nature, the alpha male isn't just a brutal, mindless tyrant who beats up the smaller chimps.
The true alpha is the keystone of the society. He is the one who actively mediates conflicts between troop members, he consoles the losers of fights, and most importantly, he is the one who places himself in the greatest physical danger to protect the troop from outside predators.
He holds the highest status, but he bears the absolute heaviest burden.
Riker translates this biological reality to human structures, using Elon Musk famously sleeping on the floor of the Tesla Gigafactory during production crunches as a modern equivalent.
Riker argues that an effective corporate or social hierarchy relies on harsh performance standards, accountability, and unilateral decision-making.
And he asserts that these harsh, male-coded hierarchies will out-innovate and outproduce soft, consensus-driven egalitarian models every single time.
He contrasts the raw building power of the old-school Protestant work ethic with the suffocating environment of modern corporate HR culture.
To show what the work ethic used to mean, he tells the brutal history of the Ford Hunger Marchers in 1932.
During the depths of the Great Depression, thousands of unemployed men marched in the freezing cold to the gates of the River Rouge auto plant in Michigan.
They weren't asking for handouts, they were demanding the dignity of labor.
They were met with tear gas and machine gun fire, and 4 men were killed on the spot, fighting simply for the right to work and provide for their starving families.
Riker contrasts that raw, visceral, life-or-death physical sacrifice with the modern, sterile corporate trend of quiet quitting.
And the constant demands for mental health days because an email tone was perceived as too demanding.
Riker believes that bloated HR departments have successfully replaced the male drive for pride and craftsmanship with mandatory, soul-crushing sensitivity training.
In dismantling the HR worldview, Riker is highly critical of the mainstream narrative surrounding the gender pay gap.
He doesn't just dismiss it, he attacks the methodology behind it. He cites detailed data from the American Association of University Women, the AAUW.
Showing that when you stop looking at median earnings and actually control for the relevant variables, the specific number of hours worked per week, continuous years of experience without career breaks, and crucially, the physical danger and unpleasantness of the occupation, the so-called wage gap, virtually vanishes to a few cents.
He argues that the political left intentionally uses flawed aggregated data to demonize male productivity, effectively framing the natural results of male ambition and risk tolerance as systemic theft from women.
And when he talks about risk tolerance, he emphasizes the absolute tragic invisibility of male sacrifice in the physical workplace.
He drops a statistic that should stop everyone in their tracks. 97% of all workplace fatalities are men.
It's men falling off slippery roofs, men getting crushed in heavy machinery, men suffocating in mines, and men falling from cell towers.
To put a human face on this grim data, he tells the story of an anonymous miner involved in a 2019 Colorado mine collapse.
When the shafts started to give way, this one miner didn't run to the exit. He stayed behind in the absolute darkness, physically holding up a failing structural beam with his own body so that 12 other men could crawl out through the gap and escape to the surface.
The tunnel collapsed on him and he died doing it.
And as Riker points out with palpable anger, this man's ultimate sacrifice was barely a footnote in the national media.
Riker argues that modern society happily exploits male labor, male sweat, and male blood to build and maintain the physical infrastructure of the world,
The roads, the power grids, the plumbing.
while simultaneously, in its academic towers, labeling the very biological traits that allow men to do these incredibly dangerous jobs: stoicism, aggression, physical dominance, as toxic masculinity.
This systemic exploitation and simultaneous cultural demonization doesn't just stay in the civilian workforce. Riker traces it directly into the military.
He claims that the armed forces, the ultimate bastion of traditional male hierarchy, have undergone a massive, deliberate feminization that threatens national survival.
He points to NATO's heavily funded $1.2 billion women, peace and security agenda, and the relentless push for gender-neutral language initiatives across all branches of the military.
Riker views this as a fatal prioritization of HR compliance and diversity metrics over lethal combat readiness.
The anecdotes he shares from the modern military are honestly hard to listen to. He talks about a highly decorated Royal Marine veteran in the UK who applied for re-enlistment but was flatly denied.
Why? Because he refused to participate in a mandatory circle-time emotional integration training session.
His official file literally noted that he was resistant to vulnerability, a combat veteran, denied service because he wasn't vulnerable enough.
He also talks about a tragic incident involving German troops deployed on a peacekeeping mission in Mali.
A patrol was ambushed by jihadists, but because their highly bureaucratized, feminized rules of engagement were so restrictive, they were required to call back to command to get legal permission before returning fire.
Men died because the system prioritized process over survival.
Riker aggressively contrasts this bureaucratic decline of Western militaries with the actions of geopolitical rivals, specifically China.
While NATO debates gender-neutral pronouns, Riker notes that China is engaged in a massive, unbureaucratic buildup of hard physical power.
Hypersonic missiles, advanced drone swarms, and AI-driven warfare.
Riker's geopolitical philosophy here is brutally pragmatic. He argues that true peace is never achieved simply by the absence of conflict or through diplomatic empathy.
Peace is maintained, and only maintained, by the active presence of dangerous men who are highly trained, fiercely loyal, and entirely willing to engage in extreme, overwhelming violence on behalf of their civilization.
When a culture replaces the rugged warrior ethos with the language of therapy and vulnerability, Riker warns it doesn't achieve enlightenment, it invites conquest.
Which leads us to the final, and perhaps most actionable phase of Riker's massive argument.
If the family courts are rigged, if the schools pathologize boys, if academia outlaws logic, if the dating market is a slot machine, and if the corporate and military hierarchies are compromised by HR, where do men go?
How do they survive?
No.
This is Body Section 6, Myth, Faith, and Rebuilding Civilization, covering chapters 10, 11, 16, and 20.
Riker first looks at the spiritual landscape, specifically the dramatic decline of mainline religious institutions.
He points out that major denominations like the Episcopal Church and the Southern Baptist Convention have hemorrhaged massive amounts of male membership in recent decades.
And he argues this happened precisely because they softened their hard doctrines to become more socially inclusive and adopt the language of modern therapy.
From a psychological perspective, Riker argues that men are not drawn to a religion that simply acts as a celestial therapist, telling them that they are perfectly fine just the way they are.
Men, he claims, inherently desire a faith that demands something difficult from them, a system that requires sacrifice, rigorous discipline, and harsh accountability.
To prove this, he points to the surprising counter-movement, the explosive rise of hardline ascetic, male-only faith groups.
He describes his own visit to the Monastery of Christ in the desert, situated in the brutal, remote landscape of New Mexico.
He notes that young, modern men are flocking to places like this. They are intentionally seeking out extreme silence, fasting, manual labor, and strict, unquestioning obedience to an abbot.
They are seeking out the ancient warrior priest archetype because the modern mainstream church has completely swapped out the demanding nature of spiritual fatherhood for the soft facilitation of a support group.
He also looks at how our secular myths have been degraded. He analyzes Hollywood, which used to be the primary engine for creating modern mythologies that inspired boys.
He cites a leaked 2017 internal memo from Disney detailing a specific male character initiative.
The stated goal of this initiative was to intentionally reframe traditional male leads to be more emotionally available, non-dominant, and collaborative.
And you can clearly see the results of this directive in the culture. Look at how modern iterations of classic heroes like Marvel's Thor or Indiana Jones have been portrayed recently.
They are frequently written as bumbling, emotionally fragile, or constantly in need of being rescued or corrected by more competent female counterparts.
Riker sharply contrasts this modern deconstruction with older, raw, unapologetic myths. He points to the 1982 film Conan the Barbarian, or going back thousands of years to the Epic of Gilgamesh.
In those foundational stories, the heroes experience profound suffering, but they transform their pain into glorious purpose through violent action and sheer exertion of will.
Not through journaling, processing their trauma, or going to therapy.
Riker asserts that without these strong aspirational myths to guide them, and without the strong real-world fraternal organizations of the past, like the Freemasons, the Elks Lodge, or the Boy Scouts,
All of which, he notes, have either lost massive amounts of membership or fundamentally altered their male-only nature.
modern men are left entirely isolated. They are atomized individuals staring at screens.
They have no mythological map for what real courage looks like, and they have no physical brotherhood to hold them to a higher standard of accountability.
So after laying out this incredibly bleak landscape, what is Riker's ultimate solution for the men reading his book?
Surprisingly, it isn't political activism. It isn't voting harder or complaining online. It is incredibly grounded, physical, and local.
It's about the relentless acquisition of tangible skills. He says we need to stop worrying about emotional literacy and start teaching boys how to weld, how to write complex code, how to rebuild carburetors, and how to grow food.
He backs this up with a fascinating 2022 study out of MIT, which tracked teenage boys.
The study showed that boys who were taught difficult, tangible physical skills before the age of 16 had a 37% lower rate of clinical depression than boys who were forced into standard school emotional literacy programs.
Riker coins a brilliant term for this phenomenon, the adversity dividend.
It is the psychological principle that physical struggle, resistance, and the possibility of failure are not forms of trauma that need to be avoided. They are the essential, necessary training weights for the male psyche.
Without the friction of adversity, the male mind atrophies. He gives several compelling examples of men who have realized this and are abandoning the comforts of the corporate HR environment entirely to reclaim their sanity.
Yes. The examples he gives of this walkaway movement are incredible. He talks about a senior software engineer who was pulling down a massive six-figure salary at Meta.
On paper, he had won the modern game.
But he was miserable. So he quit, sold everything, and moved to the rugged backcountry of Idaho with a chainsaw and a truck.
Why? Because, as he told Riker, he desperately needed to feel his own body again. He needed to sweat, to bleed, and to escape the exhausting, endless theater of corporate vulnerability.
Riker also mentions the rise of hard work clubs popping up in places like Texas, where white-collar men literally pay money to spend their weekends chopping wood, digging ditches, and sweating together in the sun just to feel a sense of physical accomplishment and brotherhood.
And perhaps the most institutional example of this working is the initiative Riker highlights at Utah Tech University.
Recognizing the crisis in male graduation rates, the university experimented by creating specialized all-male dormitories.
But these weren't just places to sleep. They were structured environments focused entirely on hard skills.
The young men in these dorms were required to learn basic car repair, rigorous financial literacy, and face-to-face conflict resolution. They held each other accountable.
The result of this experiment, the graduation rates for the men in those specific dorms shot up by an astounding 22% in a single year.
That is proof of concept right there. Riker's ultimate message to his readers is that men must stop asking for permission from institutions that despise them.
They must focus on building parallel institutions, forging real-world brotherhoods, and reclaiming their societal value through undeniable, hard, physical competence.
As we step back and attempt to synthesize all of these dense, heavily layered, and deeply controversial arguments from Riker's book, it leaves us with a profound and frankly provocative thought to consider.
If Riker's underlying premise is actually correct, if modern society truly relies completely on the very male instincts it currently pathologizes and tries to medicate out of existence, the biological drive to build, to fight, to invent, and to physically sacrifice oneself on the altar of progress.
What happens to the literal physical infrastructure of the modern world when the last generation of these traditional men finally decides they've had enough?
What happens when they completely walk away, withdraw their labor, their taxes, and their physical protection, and decide to only build for themselves?
Wow. That is a chilling, almost Atlas Shrugged level question to mull over. It really forces you to reframe everything you see when you look out your window at the paved roads, the humming power lines, and the towering skyscrapers.
None of that exists without the exact type of men Riker is writing about.
And that brings us to the conclusion of our deep dive review of phases of life. Archetypal, Jungian, Ericksonian, Piagetian, Kohlbergian, and Freudian.
If this extensive breakdown of the red pill perspective resonated with you, or honestly, even if it just sparked a deep intellectual curiosity about how these massive cultural arguments are constructed, you absolutely need to buy the book to get the full, unfiltered experience.
We barely scratched the surface of the data he provides.
The historical depth, the psychological frameworks, and the sheer volume of data Riker compiles makes it a significant, undeniable text for anyone genuinely trying to understand the current cultural fracturing we are living through.
I want to urge you, the listener, to open a new tab and search for the book on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now. Don't wait. And be sure to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack for more essays and content exploring these exact themes.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
You, the listener, the one who wants to look past the surface narratives, are the reason we dig into these massive, heavy topics. Reminding you one last time to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive. Stay curious, stay sharp, and we will catch you on the next one.